Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the RAC Community Theater. We are delighted to be here in our new venue, courtesy of Dick and Nancy Rains. And we are especially excited because this afternoon, No Ordinary Person is back on stage at last. It's been about a 2-year COVID hiatus, but this afternoon we have 3 wonderful stories ready for you. They're going to be told by Tina Falconberry, Bev Jones, and Michael Dennis. Now, many of you may remember that the title of our show is a quote from Studs Terkel. Studs was a historian, writer, actor, radio talk show host, and over a period of several decades, he interviewed hundreds of people across the country. Many of them were very famous people, but a lot of them were not. You may be familiar, one of his books was The Good War, where he interviewed both leaders involved in the Second World War, but a lot of common soldiers from their perspective on the front lines. So when he was asked about interviewing, he said, you know, everybody has a unique story, and when you know their story, there is no such thing as an ordinary person. So here in Rappahannock, the way this evolved into a show really was born out of the Life Stories workshops that Julie Portman offered for many years. And it was my good friend, Joyce Abel, who said, these are wonderful stories, they should be on the stage. Joyce has been coaching storytellers. I thought about it, Joyce, it's been a quarter of a century. I think one thing I would say about tonight's show is that the last couple of years have been challenging in many ways. And so it's fitting that the stories that we're going to hear have to do with overcoming personal challenge in one way or another. What I want to do is acknowledge the important part you have in today. A little while back, I heard a podcast by the person who produces the Moth Radio Hour, and she said they've actually done scientific studies where they wired up people's brain, checked their brain waves, both people telling the story and people receiving the story. And the interesting thing was that after a few minutes, the brain waves of the audience started to sync up with and mirror the brain waves of the storyteller. Now, I'll take their word for the science, but from my experience as a storyteller, something quite different happens when we offer our story and it is truly listened to. So on behalf of Ed and Lynn Dolnick and myself, we all want to thank each of you for being here and completing the story loop tonight. So sit back in your chair, let your brain waves flow, and enjoy the show. I'm just a common person.
By the time I arrived in the United States in 1981, I was 18 years old, and already I had lived in 4 different countries, none of which was my homeland. Mine is the saga of a stateless person. Who am I? Where do I belong? And how do I fit in? These questions plagued me for much of my life. My parents were born in Palestine, but ever since I can remember, they always told people that we were Jordanian. Apparently, it was safer and less complicated to deny our Palestinian heritage. Our passports were, in fact, Jordanian, but how did we carry passports from someplace where none of us was born? And why did we keep moving from country to country? When I was born, my family lived in Kuwait. I don't remember anything about Kuwait except the story of my birth itself, which my mother repeated often. When you were born, they put you in my arms, and you had such a sour look on your face. You looked like this. Like an owl. Not only did I not want to look like an owl, but in my culture, our culture, an owl is a bad omen. My father had a different reaction. He was over the moon. And instead of seeing an owl face, he named me Fatin. Fatin, which in Arabic means the beautiful and charming one. Fatin. Within 2 years, my parents packed us up and we moved to Lebanon. At age 4, they enrolled me in a Catholic French school. The only problem was our native tongue is Arabic and none of us spoke French. So I'd watch the nuns speak language that made absolutely no sense to me. Mais qu'est-ce que tu fais, toi? Viens ici! Ouh la la! I thought the nuns were mean and very scary. In their black habits, covered them from head to toe. Smacking us was part of their discipline. But they especially smacked me. Beginning to understand the language, I realized I was being hit on my left hand because they were trying to force me to write with my right hand. I'd pick up the pencil and smack, take it out of my left, put into my right. Only the devil and the children of the devil write with their left hand. I cried every day. Finally, my father intervened, and he made sure that they left me alone. My mother was not so understanding. She would say, "Why are you being so difficult? Just change your hand." However, I was triumphant. And thanks to my father, I could go on using my left hand, and damn what the nuns thought. One day during religious studies, my class was in church. 10 little 4-year-olds and 2 nuns sitting around in a circle when bang! The wooden cross fell from the wall and crashed to the ground. "Mon Dieu!" screams the nun. "The devil is in here!" I was terrified, but I was pretty amazed. This power that I apparently had just by holding my pen in my left hand. Whew. At age 6, my family moved again, this time to Libya. Here, there was a choice of a French school, an Arabic school, and an American school. So guess which school they picked for me this time? The American school, because I did not speak a lick of English. Luckily, my parents spoke English, so it was a bit easier for them to communicate with the teachers this time around. Libya had been colonized by Italy, but under Muammar Gaddafi's rule, it reverted to a Muslim cultural tradition, insisting that the women cover themselves completely, their hair, their face, their body, much like the nuns in my other school. My mother was having none of that. When we went shopping, she dressed in Western style, and she spoke mainly in English. One time, she yelled at us, "Non si tocca," which means, "Don't touch," in Italian. Mom, why are you speaking Italian? I think she believed that by speaking English, sprinkled with a little Italian, she would pass as European and be exempt from the demands placed on local women. Soon, I found out it didn't matter it didn't make a difference which language we spoke, which school I attended, because no matter what, we never fit in. To the foreigners, we were the Arabs. To the local Libyan Arabs, we were the Palestinians. Or even better, or worse, the Christian Palestinians. Like every other country that we lived in, they saw us as a burden on their society. We were not allowed to own property or practice our religion. And as President Gaddafi's regime became more weirdly oppressive, we lived in fear of being deported. According to my mother, we had to lower our voices if the windows were open and speak in code. Did you put away the orange juice? That's code for the alcohol, because nobody would know. Because there was always spies lurking below. And it became apparent that we could trust no one. So, Palestine, Palestinian. Such elusive words. Words that seem to carry both pride and shame, guilt and fear. But how did all this come about? And why were we unable to visit my grandmothers and cousins in Palestine? How was it that Palestine no longer existed on maps? Why were we always unwanted in every country? Growing older, I learned more about my family history and the history of Palestine. The Ottomans had ruled Palestine until their defeat by the British at the end of World War I. And in the post-war carve-up of the Middle East, Britain took control of Palestine, saying that it would be just keep a military presence until the Palestinians were ready for self-rule. But then the double cross. Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, announcing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, essentially promising them our land where we Palestinians made up over 90% of the population. And as the British allowed the European Jews to migrate to Palestine, what ensued was inevitable. Bloody friction between the Palestinians and the British Army, and clashes between the British and the growing, well-armed Zionist militias. The Zionists began to systematically attack and ethnically cleanse hundreds of Palestinian Arab villages and cities. In 1948, my father was only 16, and my mother was only 11. Their families were forced from their homes. My mother's family, heeding warnings of trouble to come by their Arab elders, fled from Jerusalem to Ramallah and never were allowed to return. My dad's family, living in the Galilee in the north of Palestine, fled their village in fear of war. They did not stay away for very long, but upon returning, they found many homes, and most of their olive groves were confiscated. They had lost their livelihood. During all this, the British just washed their hands of the situation and simply withdrew, leaving the Zionists to continue their relentless efforts to overwhelm the Palestinians. They arrested my father at 16, along with many boys of fighting age, and they were all piled up onto a truck, barefoot and blindfolded. After many agonizing and fear-filled miles, the boys were eventually herded off the truck and instructed to run for their lives as the Zionists began to shoot at them. My father ran, stumbling over rocks, thinking he would die. He ran until he could no longer hear gunshots. And then he removed his blindfold. And in the pitch dark, he spotted a light in the distance. He walked towards that light for several hours before realizing he had been dumped over the border. He was now in Lebanon. Somehow, he managed to locate a family friend who took him in. But before he could get word to his family that he was safe, word came that his father, my grandfather, had passed away from a heart attack. My mother remained with her family. They settled in Ramallah, which at the time was part of Jordan and now of the West Bank. Her family of 10 squeezed into a one-bedroom basement apartment. And within the year, she too lost her father to a heart attack. So here were two very young people whose lives were mashed in the wheels of history. They not only lost their homes, but their family patriarchs as well. I was in my teens before I really found out what my parents endured during the 1948 war, before I began to understand the origins of my mother's bitterness and my father's tender sadness, and their determination and struggle to provide the best life in the States. I felt I should go back to the United Kingdom, the place where my parents had established residency after they had been forced to leave Libya. So I applied for residency, but I was denied. The British Home Office declared I was too old to live with my parents, and they were kicking me out, suggesting very helpfully that I could go either to Kuwait, my birthplace, or to Jordan. I wanted neither. The Kuwaiti government had made it abundantly clear that we Palestinians never would have any rights in their country. But I did have that Jordanian passport. Turns out, my mother's family was given citizenship when they fled to Ramallah in 1948, but it was not my homeland. I knew no one in the entire country, and regardless, there was no way to go alone to an Arab country as a single young female. So in the end, after much consternation on my part, I decided the best place for me would be to go back to the United States. I still had to go with my father to Amman, Jordan, because obviously I needed to go and get a visa to come back to the United States. Actually, I was actually excited about going to Jordan because with my Jordanian passport, I was expecting finally to be greeted upon arrival with the words, "Welcome home." That's not what happened. Instead, armed soldiers met us at the airport entrance. They escorted us to separate rooms, and they began to frisk us. So much for a welcome home. But our visit to the American Embassy was successful, and I was granted a highly coveted visa to work in the United States. When I arrived in Washington, D.C., my friends from Washington University helped me with job leads. In a matter of weeks, I was working with an architecture firm. I also hired a lawyer, filed for a green card, and became a permanent resident of the United States. I was very proud to have accomplished this on my own, because 4 years later, when I met a handsome young wasp from North Carolina, I was happy to have my immigration status secured before he asked me to marry him. A few years later, I completed my path to citizenship. As we waited for the ceremony to begin, we were given the program outlining the events of the day and naming all the countries that we represented. A quick peek, and I saw Palestine written on the sheet. The judge said, "When I call your country, please stand up." I was elated. Finally, I was going to stand up publicly for my real country. He went down the list in alphabetical order. And when he got to Jordan, I remained seated. And I waited until I heard him say Palestine, at which point I rose proudly. And the judge said, "Please raise your right hand." Obviously, not your left. "Do you swear to forego all alliance to your country of origin and dedicate your life to the United States of America?" Ooh, wow. So in a space of a few minutes, I had both finally claimed my Palestinian heritage and then immediately sworn to forego all allegiance to the place of my ancestry. Later that year, with my US passport in hand, my husband, my daughter, and I traveled to visit my parents in London. It was the first time ever that I was without a visa. And when I entered back into the United States, I finally heard and truly felt the words, "Welcome home."
I had my first big career break when I was 13. I started early to earn money because my parents encouraged kids to pay their own way. They'd come to the States after Dad left the New Zealand Army at the end of World War II, and they said, "You can be anything you want in America, but you have to get out there and work for it." My big opportunity was a job in the fashion office of LaSalle's, the department store in Toledo, Ohio. I started there in junior high as a volunteer model in small events staged in the store's restaurant. But then they gave me a paid job, helping to prepare for major fashion shows at the amazing wage of $2 an hour. My favorite task was running around the big store, pulling accessories like hats and pearl earrings. For a single show, I might have to collect as many as 50 pairs of shorties. Those were those short, wider beige gloves that models had to wear to complement their ladylike outfits. When I modeled in a show, I was not one of those beautiful, tall girls who wore wedding gowns. I was the little one. At about 5'1", I could wear preteen fashions even as a senior in high school. But modeling kids' clothes meant that I had to stay skinny. I was thinking about that one day as I sat at the kitchen table sipping tea after school. Now, in the Jones family, true to our British roots, tea parties were how we spent time together. Even a little kid could enjoy tea, loaded up with milk and sugar and always served in a bone china teacup. So, that afternoon, as I took a sip, I thought about how I loved the tea ritual, and yet, to stay slim, I needed to eat much less sugar. Then, I was inspired to reduce so gradually, I'd never even miss it. As I sat there, staring at a heaping teaspoon, I decided to start by removing just one little pinch. Then every day, I'd remove another grain or two, and I'd never even notice a taste change. Well, I did that, and soon I'd learned to drink sugarless tea without a moment of feeling deprived. After my career in fashion and high school, I headed off to study journalism at Ohio University. I arrived at OU in 1964 with the first of the baby boomers. I loved the little college town of Athens, tucked into the hills of southeastern Ohio, and I was thrilled to be on my own. But My first days on campus brought some shocks. One of them was the co-ed handbook. This pamphlet described the curfews, dress codes, and other special rules for female students. It said that, as a freshman woman, on weeknights, I had to be in the dorm by 10 o'clock. I had to wear a skirt to dinner and to classes. For Sunday dinner, I had to wear nylon stockings and high heels. And for those who wanted to light up, the rule said women could smoke in public, but only if they were sitting, because ladies never smoke while standing. I totally enjoyed college, despite these silly rules for women. I just figured that's how life is. By the spring of '68, I was a senior, and I'd completed my journalism major, and I was doing an honors project in literature. My topic was how women became the first existential characters in early novels. I know, it sounds pretty pompous now. I still think my idea was good. My point was that while male characters in early fiction seemed like cartoons, female characters began to examine their own lives. In other words, women like Jane Austen's Elizabeth Bennet were self-aware. And a reason they didn't just take things for granted is that they looked at society from the position of outsiders. Elizabeth Bennet was insightful about herself because she saw the absurdity of the social restrictions that limited her life. I never completed my thesis. That's because my male advisor rejected the topic. He said existential philosophers believe that women cannot be fully developed people. Those uppity French guys wrote that women are defined only by their relationships with men. They claim that women are born to serve and support men, and they don't have what it takes to be fully grown people, either in novels or in life. I'd read stacks of books and had weekly one-on-one conversations with my advisor, and I thought of this professor as my mentor. Now, I was shocked by his acceptance of the idea that some people are just better than other people. I was crushed by his comments on the second-class abilities of women, so I refused to change topics. And when my advisor threatened me with an F, I said, I don't care. Sadly, it turned out that students who did not complete their honors theses got an incomplete instead of an F. And I discovered that even though I had all the requirements, I could not graduate with an incomplete on my record. But still, I did not budge. I said I didn't want to graduate from a university that required me to acknowledge that I could not become a complete human being. And so I finished that academic year without a diploma. Suddenly, I felt like I was a Jane Austen character, and I saw the ridiculous rules and limits everywhere in our lives. Of course, I'd been annoyed by special policies for women like curfews and dress codes, but it had not yet hit me that these rules reflected an assessment of women as people who are weaker, less talented, and essentially inferior to men. I was so hurt and angry. I knew I had to do something just to get on with my life. And then I remembered the power of creating change through tiny steps. And I decided to launch what I thought of as the sugar grain process. I didn't really think I could change society, but to move past my own pain, I had to at least make a statement. So I pledged that for every day I stayed at OU, I would do at least one tiny thing in support of equality for women. At first, it was easy, and my thing might be as basic as speaking up in a class. But soon it became harder to think up my thing for the day, and I had to move out of my comfort zone. So I met with women friends, and we started a group. I spoke to every class or club that would have me, and I offered to give speeches to all male groups like the Bar Association and the Rotary Club. Now, I was born a cautious person, and many of these activities were things I did not want to do. But the pain when I did nothing was worse than the fear of doing a little something, so I kept going. And as it turned out, the sugar grain process went on much longer than I'd first expected. On what should have been my graduation day, I married a classmate who happened to be editor of the student newspaper, The Post. Now, if some of you friends out there in the audience are thinking, that's when I married Andy Alexander, well, you're wrong. He's 2 years younger than me, and when he was a sophomore, but I was a senior, we never thought of dating. My husband, in what turned out to be just a little starter marriage, he hated the war in Vietnam, and he wanted to fight the military draft. He planned to stay in Athens to grapple with his draft board, and a counselor told us that if he went to jail, I could not visit unless we were married. So we put a notice on the Post bulletin board as a general invitation to our wedding. My parents, always willing to let me set my own course, tolerated our ceremony. It was off campus in a lodge hall that was tented with silk Army surplus parachutes. Before our vows, a musician friend played jazz on the keyboard, while his buddy accompanied him with a tasteful psychedelic light show, projected against all that white silk. It was the 60s. Once we were married, I looked for work. In those days, OU hired a few honors grads from each class. Men were brought in as junior managers, and women joined the secretarial rank at half the salary. Maybe nobody noticed I hadn't graduated, and I became a secretary in the office of the executive vice president. From there, I had a good vantage point for learning about how a university operates and for spotting new ideas for my daily things. One day, after I'd worked as a secretary for a while, the dean of the College of Business walked into my office and pulled up a chair by my desk. He said he'd noticed my feminist commentary and was getting a bit tired of it. He suggested that instead of just talking, I should become the first woman in his MBA program. He said, Bev, if you want to change things, you need tools, and you can get tools in a business program. The dean said it wouldn't be easy because most faculty and just about all the students hated the idea of allowing women in MBA programs. It's hard to believe now, but in those days, women often were unwelcome in professional programs on the grounds that graduate student was just wasted on women because we'd just quit work and have babies. The dean's offer was attractive, and I said yes, but I told him there was just one problem. I had not graduated. I explained what had happened, and he waved his hand, not worried about any decision from the English department. And so, as a bonus, once I was accepted into grad school, my undergraduate diploma mysteriously arrived in our mailbox, only about a year late. Being the only woman in the business program was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Some of my classmates mocked me, but most of them just shunned me. It toughened me up, but it was very lonely. Eventually, I found a job writing for WOUB, the public media affiliate at OU. And things got easier when I shifted my business studies to just part-time. Doing radio shows gave me a new way to deliver my messages, and soon my voice was very well known around campus. It annoyed a lot of people. Then my second great career opportunity came in 1971. The OU president invited me into his office and said it was time for me to put my money where my mouth was. He asked me to spend a year writing a report in support of my claims that OU was routinely discriminating against women. He gave me an executive office and the title of Assistant to the President. Despite my new title, I didn't think the president lawyer expected much from me and my report. If he were serious, wouldn't he have appointed a blue ribbon committee and not just a 25-year-old grad student? I was not confident of my mandate and wasn't sure how to go about the project. So no, anger didn't keep me up at night. Fear is what kept me awake. I was terrified that I'd let other women down, but mostly I was just afraid I'd make a fool of myself. So I applied the sugar grain process and just started working, figuring things out a bit at a time. I could usually overcome the little fear of taking one small step because the action helped me overcome the massive fear of total failure. I interviewed scores of students, faculty members, and other staff, from house cleaners to the dean of women. And I did lots of other research. In writing my report, I tried to build a case that the university was engaged in systematic discrimination. Of course, I hinted that we women had the potential to bring a lawsuit. When I delivered the report, I included 21 recommendations for change. Of these, one of my favorites was to allow women to join the popular OU band, then known as 110 Marching Men. The president accepted 18 of my suggestions and promoted me to create an equal opportunity program. I cannot overstate how unprepared I was for that leadership role. I was scared and I didn't know much about management, but now at least I had a sense of how to keep myself hustling, and I pushed ahead with sugar grains. That job worked out pretty well. And then, in '75, I headed off to Washington to work my way through law school. And I've been working ever since, these days as an executive coach. But now I'm 75 years old. And I'm thinking about how to structure the next decade of my life. To you, it may seem that at this age, framing my life with a series of career goals no longer makes sense. But here's what I found. It's not really about the goals. The goals are just triggers. They stimulate a bit of courage to help me try something new. The joy is in the action. Goals are powerful because they push me out there to do something. When I have career-type goals, I just keep doing little things, and these small actions are the juice. For me, sugar grains are still sweet.
Good afternoon. Reading came hard for me. You see, I'm a product of an experiment by the South Dakota public school system in the early 1960s in teaching children how to read. Well, maybe it worked for some students, but it did not work for me. That experiment, combined with undiagnosed dyslexia, left me frustrated, confused, and unable to spell. That's a handicap that still haunts me to this day. And in fact, my husband tells people that my spelling brings tears to his eyes. And that experiment also gave me a very real dislike of reading. I think the things, however, that contributed to my learning disabilities also fueled my artistic talents. From a very early age, I was very good at drawing and painting and making things and at playing the piano. In fact, I can't even remember a time in my life when I did not know how to play the piano, and it is still my greatest passion, a part of my daily existence. My parents recognized this. In fact, my mother went out of her way to encourage my artistic interests. For example, when I was in my first year of the second grade, you heard me right, when I was in the first year of the second grade, my mother thought that I might enjoy being introduced to the theater. Well, there wasn't a lot of choices in Rapid City, so she took me to see a high school production of Rodgers and Hammerstein's The King and I. We got all dressed up, and I went to what was my first theatrical experience. Well, the whole evening was mesmerizing, but what really made the most impact were the costumes. And what I liked best was the hoop skirts. I was so fixated that I decided I would go home and figure out how to draw one. I found that I could make a perfect symmetrical form by drawing one side, folding the paper in half, tracing the mirror image, unfolding it, and I had the perfect outline. And by adding decoration and detail, voila, I had a drawing of a hoop skirt. Well, I spent the rest of my first year of the second grade designing 19th century ball gowns. That led to my second year of the second grade. However, I look at it now and I realize that it actually was my first introduction into the world of design, which has dominated every aspect of my education, my career, and my life ever since. Well, I was so busy drawing dresses that the rest of my studies got shortchanged, including reading. And my parents saw that I was falling behind, so they convinced the school to hold me back a year. I don't remember that I was upset by being made to take the second grade a second time. In fact, it seemed to be sort of logical to me that one would take the second grade 2 times. But I've done the math, and if you follow that logic through, 3 years for the third grade, 4 years for the fourth grade, I've calculated that it would take me 75 more years to finish high school. That would be the class of 2042. I would be 85 years old. And I think that by attrition alone, that qualifies me to be class valedictorian. Well, with the help of 2 very dedicated women in the 5th grade and the 7th grade, I did learn to read, but not very well. Reading was always a chore for me that I had to do in order to get by. And even now, I read very slowly, hearing every word out loud in my mind. Well, now, you would think that someone that disliked reading wouldn't have much interest in books. Ironically, that's not the case. I have always had an interest in books as objects. I wanted to know how to make them, long before I actually cared to read them. I'm not sure why, but I do remember where and when that my fascination with well-made hand-bound books began. My mother subscribed to a series of Time Life books on arts and crafts for me. And in one of these books, there was a long article with photographs, diagrams, and instructions on how to execute a traditional, full-leather, handmade book. I still have that book on my shelf in my studio in Flint Hill today. There was a picture of a handsome, if quirky-looking young man tooling gold leaf decorations on the book cover in green Moroccan leather. He was the bookbinder and the author of the article, a man named Richard Minsky. I wanted to learn to make such books. I really wanted to be him. Well, many years later, when my husband Paul and I rented an apartment in Manhattan, I found that the New York Center for Book Arts just happened to be located around the corner. And I thought I really should get involved with this organization. So I went there one evening to the opening of an exhibition. I found the people there very cliquish and unwelcoming, especially when they realized that my bookbindery and bookstore were located in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. But there was one other man in the room who seemed to be on the fringes like me, a crusty old disheveled old curmudgeon covered in crumbs who was making his evening meal of appetizers from the buffet. Well, I thought to myself, maybe this guy will talk to me. So I went over and I said hello. He introduced himself as one of the founders of the Center for Creative Book Arts. His name was Richard. And as we talked, I began to realize that he was the young man, now old, who had written the article in the book that my mother gave me. And I have to smile now when I think about it. I wanted to be this guy, and now I see that I have become him. My mother would say, "You be careful what you wish for." Well, despite my interest in books, it never occurred to me that reading one could actually be pleasurable. They were simply wonderful objects to look at and hold. And in 10 years that, I remember first, I never had books, and my first partner was not a reader. The 10 years we were together, we never had books in our apartment. It was not until that relationship ended, and I was living alone for the first time in my life, nearing age 30, that I really discovered reading. I mean, reading out of curiosity, reading for entertainment, reading for pleasure. I was living in a 300 square foot studio apartment in Adams Morgan. It was what used to be called a bachelor's studio. It was just a room and a bath. It was intended for a young man making his way toward marriage, a home, and a family. And at some point, they had stuck a kitchenette into the corner. Well, at the time, it suited me just fine. And there was just enough room to squeeze in my 48-inch Yamaha studio upright piano. It was there, in that tiny apartment, that I faced my crippling inability to play in front of people, which had kept me from applying to music school and led me to my choice to study visual arts and design instead. But there, knowing that the people in the hallway were listening to me, but they could not see me, gave me anonymity. It was like a force field, a cloak of invisibility, which pacified my anxieties, and I slowly became more comfortable playing in front of people. I can play now with other people around, but it's better if they're in another room where they can't see me. Something else happened in that apartment. I discovered reading for pleasure, and it happened like this. My sister in Rapid City sent me this copy of Willa Cather's novel, My Antonia, published by Houghton Mifflin in 1918. This is a battered vintage edition in a cloth-covered case binding that Mifflin issued in 1926. Now, I was not totally unfamiliar with Willa Cather. I knew that she wrote about the prairie and life on the prairie, and one of my mother's cousins was named Willa after her. I thought, well, you know, it won't kill me to read this book, and I did have time in the evenings when it was too late for me to play. So I began, and to my surprise, I actually found it engaging. It is the story of an orphaned boy from Virginia who is sent to Nebraska to be raised by his grandparents on their homestead. Incidentally, before moving to Nebraska as a girl, Cather herself spent her early childhood in Virginia living with her grandparents in their antebellum brick house called Willowshade. That house still stands not far from here, west of Winchester. You can see it still by the side of the road on Route 50 at Back Creek near Gore. In the novel, the Schmerdas, a family of immigrants from Bohemia, arrive. They spend their last dollar to buy out a neighboring failed homestead. The elder daughter, Antonia, and the orphan boy, Jim Burden, become friends. Together they share the experiences of this new place that affect their lives, even though they go very different ways. Now, I could relate to this. My family was part of the first wave of homesteaders. My mother's grandfather, Ole, immigrated with his parents and siblings from Laerdal, Norway in 1857. Ole and his brother Louis came to Dakota Territory in 1878, and they settled on adjacent homesteads. They sent back to their village in Laerdal for two sisters to become their wives, who were 20 years younger than them. My great-grandmother Dora and her sister Ragnhild. I clearly remember as a boy times when we would visit that homestead on the prairie at the foot of the Black Hills. The ruins of the sod dugout in which they lived when they first came to this place were still visible, not far from the frame house that Ole later built and where my grandmother was born in 1908. It also still stands, And on a windswept, treeless knoll not far from that house is a little cemetery where my great-great-grandmother was the first settler to be laid to rest. When I was reading my Antonia, something happened to me, something that changed reading for me. And I remember the exact passage I read that made the impact. Cather writes a story within a story. It is the story of Mr. Schmerda, a gentle old man. He had been a violinist and a weaver of tapestries in the old country, and he was not cut out to be a homesteader on the Nebraska plains. It was his domineering wife that was behind their immigration to America. Well, Mr. Schmerda's struggles plunge him into a deep, irreversible depression. Cather describes him like something from which all warmth and light had died out. Poverty, hunger, cold, and the loss that all that was beautiful to him drive him to suicide. Because he had killed himself, the Bohemian Catholics refused him burial in their churchyard. Lutherans wouldn't have him either. So the irascible Mrs. Schmerda is determined to make a point of the matter. She decides to bury him on the back corner of their homestead where the section lines converged, knowing that at some point in the future, when the roads would be laid out along the lines, that Mr. Schmerda's grave would be in the way, and the Schmerdas would have the last word. And so it was. And we come to the passage in Cather's book that made such a strong impact on me. Jim Burton, as a growing man, is reflecting, and he speaks. Years afterward, when the open grazing days were over, and the red grass had been plowed under and under until it was almost gone from the prairie, when all the fields were under fence, and the roads no longer ran about like wild things, but followed the surveyed section lines, Mr. Schmerda's grave was still there. It was surrounded by sagging wire fence and an unpainted wooden cross. And as grandfather predicted, Mrs. Schmerda never saw those roads going over his head. The road from the north curved a little to the east just there, and the road from the west, it swung out to the south, so that the grave, with its tall red grass that was never mowed, looked like a little island. And at twilight, under a new moon or clear evening star, the dusty roads looked like soft gray rivers flowing past it. I never came upon that place without emotion, and in all that country it was the spot that was most dear to me. I loved the mild superstition, the propitiatory intent that had put the grave there, and still more, I loved the spirit that could not carry out the sentence, the air from the surveyed lines, the clemency of the soft earth roads along which the homecoming wagons rattled after sunset. Never a tired driver passed that wooden cross, I am sure, without wishing well to the sleeper. When I finished reading those lines, I put the book down. I thought about it for a minute, and I picked it back up and I read the passage again. And it was in those moments that I realized that reading could be a pleasure, that the beauty of language could be so powerful, that writing could paint pictures in my mind, that I could hear the sounds of the sentences like music. I realized for the first time that words could be as powerful as a paintbrush or a piano. And so it was that I began to read. Cather naturally led me to other authors who wrote about the world I came from, writers such as Marie Sandows, Kathleen Norris, Wallace Stegner, and Ivan Doig, and to Cather's dear friend and mentor, Sarah Orne Jewett, author of The Country of the Pointed Firs, who led me to Edith Wharton, who led me to Henry James, who led me to Truman Capote, who led me to your Dora Welty and all the Southern writers. Reading opened a whole new world for me as one writer led to another writer. But I frequently came back to Cather, and for a long time, I thought it was because I was attracted to her stories, because of the place and the history was so familiar to me. But I began to see another theme that permeates much of her work, a theme that is perhaps even more relevant to me. that being the story of the misplaced and misunderstood artist longing to escape the confines of the place and circumstances in which they find themselves. Sort of like the story of Mr. Shmerda. Another example, perhaps even more close to me, is Cather's short story, Paul Case, from 1905. Paul is an effeminate, sensitive, artistic dandy who finds his life in a small provincial city unbearable. He steals a large sum of money from his employer in order to escape to New York City in search of a beautiful world. To use more modern language, I would say Paul is a gay boy, and he's desperate to escape the world in which he lives. Of course, Cather doesn't come out and say Paul is gay. The label didn't even exist as we know it in 1905. The use of the term gay to refer to homosexual men begins to emerge in the 1920s, and really doesn't become common until after the Second World War. Cather, who was herself lesbian, but never actually acknowledged it, never openly addressed the subject of homosexuality in her stories, but it's easy enough to read between the lines. Paul was just the first of her gay characters that Cather draws with such special sympathy. I saw myself in Paul. I always dreamed of leaving South Dakota for the big city, where I was sure that everything would be beautiful. I always felt that I was in the wrong place and that people didn't understand me. I wasn't like the other boys. I would rather play the piano than play ball. I was fastidiously neat, ironically a trait that I find is endemic to almost every bookbinder I know. I was constantly rearranging my mother's living room to make it more pleasant. And my favorite toy was our vacuum cleaner. And I was drawn to beautiful things. I vividly remember the first thing of beauty I experienced. It was my Aunt Helma's funeral. She was actually my mother's aunt by marriage to her uncle, who we called Slim. Now, I wasn't very close to her, and I didn't feel any great sadness at her passing. I guess my mother thought that taking me to her funeral would be a good learning experience. She explained to me that it was to be an open casket service and that my Aunt Helma's lifeless body would be there and I should prepare myself. Well, beyond my dead Aunt Helma, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but now I remember it as a thing of true beauty. The service was at the funeral home in Balfour, South Dakota, my mother's hometown. I guess it was being held in the funeral home chapel because the Lutheran Church many years before had politely invited Uncle Slim not to return. I was all dressed up in a little houndstooth blazer and I felt quite smart. And as we went into the funeral home, we were greeted by the funeral director, a tall man in a dark suit. It had been explained to me that he was the person who had taken care of Aunt Helma, whatever that meant. As we entered the chapel, I was overwhelmed. Everything was beautiful. The room was beautiful. The flowers were beautiful. The music was beautiful. The casket was beautiful. Even Aunt Helma was beautiful. And I thought, my God, this is even better than the king and I. And if this guy could make Aunt Helma look that good, then this was the line of work for me. And I decided then and there that I was going to become a funeral director. So during the summer that followed, I started a pet cemetery. I buried every parakeet, hamster, gerbil, and guinea pig that died in our neighborhood, as well as small roadkill. And these were not ordinary interments. They were productions. I had services with flowers and music, and there was a small fountain which was fed by our garden hose, and I even carved little headstones out of pieces of gypsum to mark the graves. But the best funeral I ever produced was for my pet turtle, who had been stepped on by my sister when he escaped from the little kidney-shaped bowl of the plastic palm tree. I used a small oval box that my mother's Bulova watch had come in as a casket. It was just the right shape and the right size for a small turtle. And it was lined with white satin, and it had a little domed lid that popped open for display, which made it perfect for an open casket service. Well, it never got better than that. The pet cemetery no longer exists. Without the clemency that was afforded to Mr. Shmerda, my father decided to build a garage on the spot. It now lies entombed under a slab of concrete, just like Jimmy Hoffa. Well, I never became a funeral director, but I see now that my flirtation with the funeral part of business was just my foray into the world of production and exhibit design. However, my experience burying pets in our neighborhood still serves me well. On occasion, when I'm at a dinner party and I'm asked the question, "What do you do?" and I'm just too exhausted to deal with the complications of explaining design or book arts, I simply tell them I'm a mortician. Well, I did learn to read, and I learned to love reading, and to make books, and I did get away. And I found much in life that is truly beautiful. But like many of the characters in Cather's stories, like Jim Burden looking back on his time with Antonia on the Nebraska plains, I was drawn to return. Now, my journey has not taken me back to the prairie of South Dakota or the Black Hills, but it has brought me to a place very reminiscent, the Blue Ridge of Rappahannock County and the little village of Flint Hill. I can't change where I'm from, not figuratively or literally, but like the artists in Cather's works, I have found that we might search hard for things that we believe are not within our reach, and we may even diverge from the section lines on our journey. But we find that there is much that was always there, and in returning, even if just in reflection, we find just how far we've actually come. Thank you.